and welcome back to another video. This is Lucy Learns episode 3. We are today going to be delving into a little bit of sculpting. Sculpting is not something I have done very much. I used to use polymer clay to make little keyrings and things, but I wouldn't say my sculpting is quite up to an artist degree, and therefore that's what I want to test. Now, my wonderful girlfriend purchased me some monster clay a very long time ago, a couple of years ago, because I watch a few content creators. So Draw with Jazza, he has used monster clay and cos clay quite a lot to form amazing sculptures. I also watch a gentleman called Bush on Twitch, so if you are looking at incredibly detailed sculptures, especially of the fantasy variety, I suggest going over to Twitch and having a look at Bush. I'll put it at the bottom here. He uses cos clay, which is by the same people, which is a form of polymer clay, and it's got a lot of plasticizing quality, so you can bend it once it's baked and it won't snap, unlike say your Fimo clay. But the same people developed this lovely monster clay. Now, the best thing about this is that you heat it up in the microwave and it turns almost like it turns into a liquid. It's an oil-based clay, but it's like wax. You can melt it down into a liquid, and then as it solidifies and cools down, it will become solid again and carvable. So I've tested this out a couple of times off camera, just in my own time when I first received it, and I was really trying to use it to make busts, to create people, to form people's faces. Now, if you've been following me for a while, portraiture, doing people isn't my forte. I do it every so often, but it's not the thing I enjoy. It's not the thing I feel like I'm the best at. So I never really got along with it, and for a long time this has sat here waiting to be used again. So I want to test it, I want to learn how to use it properly, and I think I want to learn how to do it using references that I'm comfortable with, so a bird or an animal. So that's what we're going to do. This is what it looks like here, monster clay, and this is obviously solidified now, but you put this in the microwave a couple of minutes at a time, and eventually it will turn into this liquid gold that you can form onto something and start to carve, which is incredible. So that's what we're going to learn for Lucy Learns episode 3. So welcome, and stick around if you want to see how we use this clay to form some sculptures. Right, so as you saw there, we stuck it in the microwave. I think I did 3 rounds of 2 minutes, and the centre was molten hot. So if you are going to use this, just be aware when it is in its liquid state like that, it is very hot. So once I'd gotten that out, I popped it to one side just to cool off a little bit. The edges were quite firm still, it was just the centre, so bear that in mind as well. And whilst that was just cooling off enough for me to handle, I started to form an armature. So I had some very thick wire, and I thought I'll form this little armature, and I found a reference image of this beautiful kingfisher, and I thought that would be perfect to try this out on. And so I formed a head, a spine, and then just a base for it to sit on my rotating it's Lazy Susan, that's the name. And that's how I started to do this sculpture. Now, the armature I probably could have fleshed out a little bit more, but obviously I would need to put this clay in the microwave to heat it up, and obviously you don't want to put metal in there. So for potential future in years to come, if ever I scrap this model once I'm done, I wanted to be able to remove the clay as easily as possible without leaving any sort of remains of the metal in there, so I don't blow my house up. So that's the only reason I didn't do a really formed armature. But if you are intending to make this out of cos clay or polymer clay, I recommend fleshing out your armature a little bit more, maybe with some tin foil as well, and then you can obviously form it around there and reduce the amount of clay you're going to be using. But because this is just practicing clay, I didn't mind using quite a lot, and actually in the end it didn't use tons, so that was great. So as you can see there, I used the soft clay. It's very, very soft at this point, not so much a liquid, but it is still warm, very, very warm, and it is obviously so soft that it's still sticking to my fingers quite a bit. And I just used that to stick the amateur wire down to my Lazy Susan and just start to bulk up the actual base of this. And I was going in there really heavy with the clay. I was lapping it on just so it can really flesh out the really thick bit, so that I could then have something to carve away on. But because this is warm, and another thing to bear in mind if you do use this stuff is that because it's warm, it's going to obviously want to keep falling off. Gravity's going to want to pull it down. So see that clump that I did on the body there? There was a long period of time off camera that I actually held it up and created like almost the feet of the kingfisher, and then hold it up so it formed the body and the wings a little bit more, but it took a long time for this to cool, so it was a bit of a long-winded process, hence why I haven't filmed it. But this is after I'd done that, so as you can see there's a lot more of a thin bit at the bottom there. And then I thought I would just fill out the base completely just to make sure it really had a hold on the bottom there and it wasn't going to tip over from the weight of more clay on top. So after a little bit of time, the clay had finally cooled off a little bit and was becoming a lot harder and easier to kind of carve into and mould a little bit more. So I started to thicken up the head, create the shape from my reference image, and obviously using a reference image that's 2D is very, very difficult. I can very easily mimic what I can see on that 2D, but when I start to turn the bird around, I've no idea what's on the other side. So I definitely had to search for more reference images, kind of try and find what the other angle may look like and what the shape of the feathers would be if it was turned a certain way. So it took some time and research into that. So something like coming up with a plan on paper might be very good for that, so that you can really plan it out. But I just, for this point of view that you're seeing here, this is the point of view that the image was, and so I'm just really thickening up those feathers and trying to bulk it out so it was roughly the same shape in a 2D perspective, and that really did help me to then just get that nice base that was right. And the best thing about this is because I don't bake it and harden it, I can carve into it as soon as it's hardened, and it's kind of hard enough for me to not leave any indents with my fingers, so it's really, really nice to be able to do that sort of thing as well. And once the clay had nicely hardened and I had the nice base shape and bulked out areas, I decided to go in with some tools and start carving things out. So I use this much thinner kind of scraper tool. I don't know what the technical terms are. I do apologise if anyone's watching that are avid sculptors, but I just use this to start kind of refining the shape a little bit more, taking down some of that bulk, creating shapes and flat areas and curved areas, and just refining that shape a little bit more, really keeping an eye on that reference and almost mimicking the direction of the feathers. I do this in my inking quite a lot, where whatever direction I'm running my pen at is obviously the direction of the fur or the feathers, and that's how I was carving this. I wasn't carving it downwards, I was carving it in the direction that the feathers would be flowing, and I feel like that helps regardless of whether you leave in this texture to show the feathers, but I feel like it does help in terms of you refining that shape and the texture. Now, a kingfisher has this really prominent brow, a very flat top and back of head, and then almost like this very heavy set eyebrow to it, and that's kind of what I'm mimicking here, as well as refining a little bit of the mouth area. And as you can see here, I'm mapping out where I think the eye should go. Now, if you look at this, and now I'm looking at it through the screen here, the eye is much farther back, and I do rectify that later, so don't be screaming at me that this eye is not in the right place. I do rectify that later, but it's obviously a bit of trial and error, and the beauty of this clay is that I can carve this out, I can add clay back on, and I'm not wasting clay, I'm not wasting material, so it's really beautiful to work with. But this eye took me quite a while. I think I was still trying to work 2D and not 3D, and it took me a while to realise how I can create depth, not just carving in a line, as you can see here, and it took me quite a while to blend that out and create the depth without carving lines. I don't know how to explain it. That's the only thing I can think of. Instead of carving lines, I was trying to carve shapes and depth in there, and that took me a long time to find and figure out how to do with this clay. So it was very much a learning process, very, very much so. Definitely areas where I really went heavy on adding detail, and I think really I shouldn't have. This is very much an exercise on trying to get the shape, the structure, the whole structure, not just the 2D side, and I don't know why I concentrated so much on some of the details, because a lot of the time they were lost when I started blending in another area, but I guess, I mean, it's a learning curve, isn't it? I'm trying to learn how to sculpt those areas, whether I could sculpt them in more detail, and I think that might be a video to come later on down the line, trying to maybe add more detail than I've added on this sculpture, because I definitely didn't go into too much depth of detail. It was definitely more of an exercise of structure, of likeness in terms of shape, and I definitely didn't focus on the detail as much as I could have, and maybe I will in the future. So something to bear in mind when you're looking at this is it's very much a rough sketch, as it were, of this bird, which in clay terms doesn't seem right, but it is. It's like a sketch on a piece of paper before you add that final paint or detail with pencils or something like that. Now this is definitely one of my favourite tools, this scrapey tool. It was brilliant. I could apply very little pressure and take off very thin scrapes of clay, or apply a hell of a lot of pressure and create big chunks of clay off this model, and it was really lovely to use. I really liked it, and I really liked the texture it gave as well. I felt like it was almost like an etched piece of stone from a museum. It was very, very nice and I liked it, and it was perfect for refining those areas and allowing me to create those flat spots where needed, or just refine that shape a little bit more. So it was very, very nice to use actually. I very much liked it. Now moving on to the wing area, I obviously bulked out that clay to kind of create that shape that I could see in my 2D reference, but it needed a lot of refinement. That looking from the back looks like a big honk of shoulder, but going through to the front, it's obviously a wing that's overlapping the breast of the bird. Now, I didn't start off doing that, and I definitely should have, because it would have refined my shape a little bit more. I went heavily in with these wings, and these feathers on the wings rather, and again, I did the whole thing of just carving in lines, which is fine to map it all out, but it took me a long time to kind of figure out how I can carve these in, because there's so many feathers, to create depth and create the image, well, the texture and the image of a feather overlaying another feather. It took me a long time to kind of figure that out without carving chunks and chunks and chunks off. So it's something I really need to work on, is doing that. And if someone has like some sort of easy cheat way of doing that, or something to do or look at that would help me do that, that would be massively helpful, because I carved all these wings in and these feathers in, and I definitely didn't add the detail to all of these feathers, because it was just taking so much of my brain power to try and figure out how to push feathers behind other feathers, etc, etc. So it was something I definitely need to work on, and it's been a bit of an eye-opener on how not very easy that would be to do in clay and ink 3D form, if that makes sense. But it was enjoyable to do, and it was enjoyable to try and mimic kind of the middle section where the wings kind of overlap, or create a little underwing area. I don't know, you'll see it in a second when I start to refine these feathers a little bit further, but I definitely carve out areas that need to be left, and I leave areas that need to be carved out. But it's again, I'm learning. It's something more difficult than I expected it to be, and it's something I'd like to work on a little bit further in the future. So as you can see here, this is where I'm struggling to kind of create that depth with these feathers, because the more I'm carving away, the less detail I'm getting, the messier it's looking, and I really, really struggle to learn where to carve off and where to just leave to create that depth. It's very difficult. It's hard to explain, but it is more difficult than you can imagine, and it does take me a very long time to figure that out, and you'll see a bit later, I do eventually figure it out to some degree, but it did take me longer than I'd like to admit to do that. So moving back onto the head, this is where I'd done the bulk of my basic sketching on the clay, and I started to work on the other side. So this is the side that's not shown on my reference image. Now, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to mimic something when you can't see all sides of it. That's the point of using a reference, is to be able to use it as a point of reference for you know, where the beak is in comparison to the eye. That's how I knew the eye was too far away. The length of the beak to the flatness of the head, etc, etc. You reference things like that. Now, when you don't have an image to do that, and you're looking at other images that are roughly what you think it should look like, it's very difficult to know that that's what it would look like. So to some degree, there's a little bit of artistic license with the other side. I've definitely pulled from about 3 other different references for it, and kind of pulled from the same dimensions as the side I can see, and kind of applied it thinking, well, the neck's going to be stretched and curved round, and so those feathers might be pulled a different way. I've really had to try and think of my anatomy, which is very difficult. I don't really study anatomy. I don't really study anatomy of birds. I kind of just replicate an image, which is why I'm trying to do these Lucy Learns a little bit more with certain things, because as much as I do replicate images, and I as you know, not to sound big-headed, but I feel like I do them very well, I think there's so much more to learn in terms of anatomy, and I think sculpting will be one of these things that would teach me anatomy a little bit more, and it's just a way of studying it. So I do recommend adding it to your arsenal if you want to, and especially using this monster clay. It's a cheaper alternative to do it. If you've finished a sketch and you keep it for a day or two, you can then pull it off that armature, like I say, pop it back into that bucket of Monster Clay, bung it back in the microwave, and hey presto, you've got fresh clay to use for another model. It's a beautiful thing to use. I have a dog and a cat. Their fur gets everywhere, and as far as I can see, there's minimal fur added into it. Obviously you've got to be careful, but it kind of absorbs it. There's nothing bad about it. It's just a really versatile medium, and I'm really pleased that I've got it and I've found a way of using it that I'm enjoying, and I definitely will be creating more models in the future. So this is me forming those shoulders like I mentioned before, and as you can see the clay is so much harder now. It's probably cooled off for a good couple of days at this point, and it's definitely much nicer to carve into and create the detail I need now, which is perfect. And so I just go in here mapping out where I think those kind of wings kind of overlap and create those shoulders. I keep referring to them shoulders. I don't really know what the actual term is for that, but to me they look like shoulders of wings, so that's what I'm creating here. When I'm looking at it now as I'm doing this voiceover, they're not quite equal. There's definitely a dip in the right hand side as you would be looking at the wings, so the left hand side as you're looking now, and it's probably not equal on both sides, but that's fine. That's something I need to learn from in the future, but it was quite fun to carve into as it's much harder to do now and much nicer to get clean carving lines. So we're now going in and adding in the detail of the face. So if you've ever seen a kingfisher, they have about 3 different feather colours on their face in different shapes and lines, and so I was just mapping that out with this tool, this metal tool here, just putting deep cuts in there just so I can show where those colours are. And then again I just created depth rather than obviously creating texture or colour, so I was creating depth by carving these out individually and making them all different depths of carved clay, if that makes sense, into the face, so that you can kind of denote that there's 3 different sections there. Whether you'd know they were different colours, I don't know, but that's kind of how I was trying to show that with the feathers on this section of the bird. Alright, so I think this is as far as I could probably take it. As you saw there, I just added a little bit of heat from my heat gun just to smooth off a few of my more rough edges. There's probably a little bit more work to do. The problem with that heat gun, it's obviously going to hit these top edges first, and it's not really getting where I want it to go, and then it melts it a bit too quick, so I didn't want to keep doing that in case I was damaging my work that I'd done. But I'm really pleased with it. I think you could probably add, there's obviously a lot of texture and feather contrast between white and blue in the top feathers here on its head and then on the wing a little bit here, but without adding loads and loads of grooves and then you kind of losing the look of it, I don't really know how else to show that. And obviously this is a reusable clay and not something you can paint. Oh, I mean, you can paint it, but it's not something I want to paint. I want to leave it in its raw form like this, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I think the proportions of the head may be a little bit big. I think possibly this could be flatter here and it comes down a little bit flatter over the beak, and maybe a bit more of a harsher flatness spot on the back here. And there probably is a few more feathers I can add in there, but for the sake of this learning video, I think we've done a good job. I've kind of mimicked the different colour changes in feathers on the head here a little bit. I've denoted where the wing kind of sits on the body, the tail feathers here. And I just overall quite like this more scratchy look that you can tell I've carved away at it, almost like a wooden sculpture. I'm really, really pleased with it. There's obviously some things that could be changed, like adding in the legs, but with this type of thing, without adding extra armature, etc., I can't really do that. Maybe some work could be done on the base to make it maybe a bit more textured, something like that. Obviously I'll show you some glamour shots at the end of this spinning with it, but I'm quite pleased with it. I think the difficulty with sculpture is obviously an image will show one thing, so my image showed this, hence why there's probably more detail to this side. I've then had to go and find other images to find maybe how the rest of the head looks, the shape of the head. There's obviously in the reference there's grooves here, so I've tried to mimic that on the other side. There's a weird groove in the middle with a flat spot here and here, which I've tried to mimic. I think the eye might be a little big, but I think for the first try, look at those beady eyes, I think it looks the beak looks very much skew on this. That's really funny, I've not looked at it from that angle. Anyway, I'm really pleased with this. I think we've done a really good job here. I'm very pleased, and with this being monster clay, I've actually not used very much of it, so there's plenty more monster clay videos to come, so if you like it, do let me know in the comments below. And I think once I feel confident enough with sculpting with this clay, I think I may move on to getting cosclay, which is the bakeable version of this, and potentially make some models that we can carve, bake, finish off with some paint, and then have a finished piece that's all coloured, etc. So that's something to look forward to in the future if you enjoy this video, so do let me know. Thank you very, very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy this video.